Hello and welcome to Arohana, a podcast series by Ananta. For today's episode, we have a very special guest with us to help decode the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict, Mr. Nandan Unnikrishnan, Distinguished Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. As India's leading scholar on Russia and the former Soviet space, he brings decades of insights into Kremlinology and strategic studies to help us unpack the complexities inherent to the conflict. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for all those kind words. Most of them untrue, but nevertheless.
To start with, let's cast the net fairly wide. Since the war in Ukraine is only a few months away from entering its fourth year, what profound change has the conflict brought to the world order, in your opinion?
Well, I don't think this is a world war which brings systemic change. I think this is more about reordering the regional order, and in this particular case, it is Europe. There was an unfinished agenda post-collapse of the Soviet Union of how the security architecture was developing. And Russia, as one of the great powers in this region, feels that its concerns are not addressed. So it has taken the radical way to sort of emphasize its concerns and try and achieve its goals. In other words, to put it in simple IR language, it's trying to reestablish its sort of control over a sphere of influence.
All right. Let's get to the global south, because that has been one of the most important aspects, which is sort of mainstream, but not quite getting the exact importance that it needs in the global discourse. Do you think Russia's push towards consolidating alliances in the global south is a measure of necessity in the short to medium term? Or is this a permanent direction in which Russian foreign policy will evolve for the foreseeable future?
You know, one thing that this war on Ukraine has done is that it has probably provided a push, an impulse towards the recognition that the world has moved from the unipolar moment and we are moving to some kind of multipolarity. It need not necessarily be a very symmetrical multipolarity, but it is a kind of multipolarity. There is also, of course, in the eyes of many analysts, the danger that this may emerge as a bipolarity. So what is happening is, in my opinion, a lot of, in this climate of uncertainty, a lot of nations are hedging. Also, a lot of nations have decided that they actually have a claim to be at the table of rule setting. India is one of them, but there are others. And in this sort of flux, as it were, Russia, and not only Russia, even other nations, feel that the greater amount of relationships they have, depending on whatever areas of interest coincide, the greater their opportunity to achieve success with this hedging policy. On Russia's part, Russia, after its, I would not call it irrevocable, but the schism that has occurred, it's going to take time for that to heal. The schism between Russia and the West has pushed Russia towards developing a greater relationships, better relationships, I would say, with countries of the global south. I also think that one of the primary reasons this impulse is, at least in the short term, very strong in Russia, is that it also helps Russia dissipate that impression that Russia is isolated. You know, the West attempted to, or is still attempting to, isolate Russia after the war in Ukraine started. But this relationships with the South, the global South, as it were, helps Russia dissipate that image And if you notice, Putin has made a couple of important visits during the duration of the war. He's been to North Korea, to Vietnam, to Saudi Arabia, to UAE. He's also received several leaders, including, of course, hosting the BRICS summit in Kazan just a couple of months, well, in October. And the Indian Prime Minister has visited Russia in July. So, to a large extent, I think Russia's relationships driven relationships with the global south are long-term relationships, but in the immediate future, they are driven by the desire to compensate for the loss of relationships with the West, economic and political. And the second is to sort of dissipate the impression that Russia is anyway isolated.
Indeed, I absolutely agree. So let's talk about the sanctions, because you briefly touched on how the West seeks to isolate Russia. So while Russia has been somewhat successful in circumventing Western sanctions and export controls to support both its military industrial complex and civilian economy, do you think structural weak points such as the lack of self-sufficiency in machine tools and semiconductors catastrophically threaten to jeopardize Moscow's state capacity across sectors?
No, obviously, Russia is going to find it difficult. I mean, it does have, as you pointed out, shortcomings in the areas of machine building, semiconductors. And this is going to, particularly the lack of semiconductors, is probably affecting the Russian economy across the board, probably even impacting its war effort. I don't know. I don't know that much detail. But if you look at the macroeconomic indicators, if you look at the uh, Russian economy as a whole, you will have to recognize that Russia's economy is actually growing. The impact of sanctions on hoping to lead to a collapse of the Russian economy have not materialized. Yes, the Russian economy is under stress, and that is reflected in the inflation that is affecting, can be visible through the effect on the Russian ruble, which has dropped to record levels. It's crossed the 100 ruble mark per dollar. But overall, I think Russia has quite successfully dealt with the challenges imposed by sanctions. And also, to be fair, and that's where the global south comes, many countries in the global south are cooperating with Russia, albeit maybe clandestinely, below the board, but to meet some of the more urgent needs of the Russian economy. So you have reports that the Chinese are helping with sort of getting in dual use items. There was recently a report that even some Indian company was taking across some chips and stuff like that. So there are many others. I mean, there are African countries that have been accused of selling aircraft parts to Russia. So obviously, the Russia is using its vast network of good relations in the global south and outside the Western world to circumvent the sanctions as best as it can. Out of my personal experience, I can tell you I was in Moscow last week. Yes, Chinese cars have taken over the streets. More than 60% of the cars are on the road are Chinese. There's no doubt about it. But it is not as if showrooms don't have Western cars. They're selling the same Mercedes, BMWs, and all. So obviously, Russia is, or Russian private sector dealers have found ways of getting these items into the country, despite sanctions, because Mercedes has left the country, BMW has left the country. But there is no dearth of Western goods in Russian supermarkets. I mean, you can buy iPhones, you can do what you want. And now there is even talk of some of the companies, retail companies, that left Russia going back to sort of restart their operations. So I would overall say that on a scale of 10, that the Russian economy has performed, despite sanctions, has performed at about 6 or 7.
Absolutely. And I think the role of Black Knights, as I think one of the strategic thinkers at Russia's RIAC outlet has pointed out in one of his op-eds, I remember, around the time of the war, that Black Knight states might be the key to the Western sanctions order.
Yeah, I know. Ivan Timofeyev, who is the head of RIAC now, he works on sanctions, he's specialized on sanctions. So I would rate him as one of the one of the world's foremost experts on sanctions. And given the experience that he has of living through them, I would take his words very seriously.
Indeed. So let's talk about Russian polity a bit. How do you see the shakeup in the Russian Ministry of Defense and National Security Council Secretariat? How do you see the current positions of Sergei Shoigu and Nikolai Patrushev in Vladimir Putin's court?
Aditya, it's trying to read the tea leaves about how things transpire in Moscow and specifically within the Kremlin is a thankless job, and I'm not going to take it up. It is very difficult. You never have enough information or knowledge to be able to make a plausible judgment on why certain things are happening and why certain things are not happening. But if you were to just read what is available in the public domain, clearly the Russian state has struggled to deal with corruption ever since its inception, ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? And while they have made some strides in it, despite the war, they're discovering that corruption thrives. Most of the cases against the deputy defense ministers, Shoigu's team, in fact, they're almost the entire lot, the charges are of corruption. Unfortunately, given the war condition, the scope for corruption increases because, the whole exercise of reconstruction in Ukraine, in the parts of Ukraine that Russia has incorporated into its territory, falls under the defense ministry. So obviously, when you have huge construction projects and everything, the temptation for unscrupulous officials is very, very high. But at the same time, the opaqueness of the system is such that it's not clear to me that Defense Minister Shoigu is necessarily tainted with this brush of corruption, because Putin has kind of moved him away from the epicenter of the volcano and put him to head the National Security Council. Now, this is where the opaqueness comes in. You don't know whether he's done this because Shoigu is a friend and he feels obliged to protect him. After all, they spend holidays together, somewhere in Siberia and various other places. So there is obviously a sort of a bromance between the two of them. And maybe Putin is trying to protect him, and which is why he moved him out from the Ministry of Defense, knowing that he is going to try and clean up those stables of corruption. So I really would hesitate to pass a judgment on how important, whether Shoigu's importance has come down or it stays at the same level. But given that the sensitivity of the post of the National Security Advisor or the head of the National Security Council, I would hazard a guess that the trust in him, even if diminished, is still substantial, right, from Mr. Putin's side. The second is Mr. Patrushev. If you judge by the presence of Mr. Patrushev in the public domain, because after all, he's been removed to an obscure area, which is shipbuilding. But if you look at his media presence, it's very high. So to me, that indicates that he still has access to the corridors of power in Kremlin. He still wields substantial influence, and that he still has the ear of the president. So I would assume that his authority has not diminished. That he's still, but he is one of those trusted partners of President Putin, who President Putin and he feel that his designation is not the most important thing, that his access and his ability to speak to the president is more important. So he has sacrificed himself to allow President Putin to move Shoigu into his position. So these are the kind of maneuvers that are really difficult to interpret, and I really don't want to venture into that domain, because I'm sure something will happen in a few weeks or months which will make me look very, very foolish.
Well, I guess I would like to add that to, I guess, the concept of Krisha, as we say in Russian, the roof, amongst the inner circle. I guess from how the situation has been handled, how the reshuffle of the cabinet has been handled after the most recent election, I think it's still safe to say that both Shoigu and Patrushev enjoy the protection of the Krisha.
No, undoubtedly. I mean, obviously, both of them. I mean, Patrushev maybe far more, but that Shoigu has survived the purge in his ministry and survived with, what we in the Orient call saving his face, is an indication that the Krisha, as you call it, or the roof, is working. It's keeping the raindrops out. But that the task of cleaning up the Ministry of Defense is a serious job that Putin wants done is indicated by the fact that he has selected Belousov, who is, even his foes concede, is incorruptible. Is being sent there, a man with no previous defense experience as such, but an extremely good economist and a good administrator. So he's been sent to clean up whatever mess the Ministry of Defense is. So I think the move against corruption is serious. Krisha also is a serious concept that continues to exist in Russian politics.
Indeed. So let's talk about the specter that we hope never comes to pass, but continues to hang over us all, even if we are a little bit away from the battlefield. Moscow has revised its nuclear doctrine document in November 2024, significantly lowering the stated nuclear use threshold. In your opinion, can India play a role in de-escalating any future scenario in which Moscow ends up contemplating nuclear use in Ukraine?
Well, Aditya, one is I will disagree with you on the significantly lowering. I think it's more, yes, it has been lowered, little doubt on that. But I would hesitate to say that it's been substantially lowered. The language has been changed a bit, and this is all about signaling between Moscow and Washington. Because Moscow is reacting, in a sense, from the very beginning of the war to the levels of escalation that NATO support for Ukraine is undergoing. If you remember, if you recall, early 22, there was no question of Western tanks or planes being given. Then subsequently that escalated. You started finding, anti-ballistic missile systems and all that stuff going into Ukraine. Then Western tanks started flowing in, and recently even F-16s have been handed over. So Russians feel that NATO has regularly sort of erased the red lines that Russia had set and is escalating. And unless this escalation is brought to an end, the danger of nuclear war will not be eliminated. And the Russians, there is a concept amongst the hardliners, as represented by Mr. Karaganov and company, that the West has lost the fear of nuclear weapons. And the whole concept of mutually assured destruction, which held back all sides, is undermined when one of the sides loses the fear of nuclear weapons. So that is why there has been, and this is the first time, I mean, if you look at it, for the first time, including Soviet history, that you have an open debate on nuclear policy. This was a no-no area. These debates were all closed door in little committees, in intellectual circuits which were closed door. But now you have it in public. You have newspaper articles written by Karaganov and those who are writing against what his position is. There are debates in public between proponents of Mr. Karaganov's view and antagonists. And Russia's strategic community is fairly divided. But one thing is very clear, that yes, there is a change in the nuclear doctrine, but this does not mean that the next red line violated will necessarily lead to nuclear war. There are several levels of escalation still possible in which Russia can attempt to convince the West that this is a wrong road to go down. Russia has methods of escalation. I mean, one of those was the use of Oreshnik recently in Dnepropetrovsk, which is a ballistic missile, a re-entry vehicle with multiple warheads, which are devastating in themselves without nuclear weapons. So I think we are some distance away from a nuclear war. But here, as I said, it is very important that the West also very carefully calibrate its support for Ukraine. Unfortunately, Biden's administration in the last sort of couple of weeks of its existence is behaving like, the schoolyard bully who's saying, give me my bat, I won't play with you anymore because you're not letting me bat, kind of thing. So, but I guess the president wants to protect his legacy, and Ukraine is an important part of his foreign policy legacy. Mr. Trump brings to the table a completely different mentality. Not that he will necessarily succeed in imposing peace, because that's a very complex issue, but nevertheless, he brings a different mentality. So I think a nuclear war is far away. As far as India's efforts are concerned, yes, Russia listens to what the Indians have to say. It takes it on board. But let's be very clear about one thing. While they lend a sympathetic ear to what India says, Russia eventually takes decisions based on what it considers as national interest. We may differ with the methods they undertake. I mean, like India does not agree with the war that Russia launched in February 2022. But the fact is that the Russians took that decision based on their national interest, their understanding of their national interest.
Indeed. And on that positive note of that nuclear war is still a prospect far away, we do not have to worry about that. I guess we can bring this to a close. And thank you for this insightful discussion, sir. And to our viewers, please do check out the next edition of Arona.
I will only say that I'm not saying it's very far away, but if all sides act responsibly, then it will not happen.
Indeed.
Thank you. Thank you, Aditya.
Thank you, sir.